Okay, so these three, so they're called registers, they're called orders, but they're the first one's the imaginary, then you have the symbolic, then you have the real, and they essentially make up the structure of, for lack of a better term, the human condition, human reality. But that's, even the term reality there, as Dave pointed out, is tricky, because what Lacan is going to call reality is just the imaginary and the symbolic. He's gonna see those two as comprising almost an order unto themselves, which is called reality, and he's going to oppose reality to the real with a capital R. And so we have to kind of talk about what the content of each of these registers is in order to understand this distinction between reality and the real. So, okay, the imaginary, Lacan first came to fame because he created an original theory of the ego, how the ego comes into being, and it's called the mere stage. And for Lacan, he thinks that early on in an infant's life, the infant is disorganized, the infant lacks control over its motor functions, its body, it lacks a sense of bodily unity, and Lacan argued that it's in its mere reflection, its reflection in the mirror. He called this image the imago, that the baby goes, oh, wait, that's me, and it gets a sense of itself as a unified being for the first time. That's where it gets the very concept of being a unified being. And it's in the reflection that it goes, that's me. But see, misrecognition is built into this. Alienation is built into this because you're not your reflection in the mirror, right? So identity always involves a fundamental misrecognition. You're always identifying with something you're not and basing your identity on this misrecognition. The French term is méconnaissance. But that's the mere stage, essentially, is that you lack bodily control, you lack a sense of unity, you see this unified image in the mirror, and you start to go, oh, okay, that's me, and that's where your sense of unity comes into play. And that's the ego, right? The first identification we make is with the imago, with the mirror image, but that is precisely not me. I'm not the image in the mirror. And so this is where there's a sense like the ego is imaginary in the sense that it depends on a fundamental misrecognition, right? You're saying I'm this thing, but that's imaginary. You're not that thing. And so the ego starts to emerge from this fundamental misrecognition and identification with the image in the mirror. So that's where we start to get the ego from. But then Lacan, as he entered his symbolic period of the 1950s, he started to rethink this, and he said, this is too simplistic. What it does is it acts like the imaginary order develops on its own. It has its own intrinsic, quote, dialectic, which is to say its own intrinsic development to it. And by the time he hits his symbolic period, he's saying, no, the development of the ego, the development of identity, it fundamentally relies on the symbolic. And so then he rethinks the mirror stage, and he says, no, for me to actually make an identification with the image, it also requires words, signifiers, and it necessitates the other, which in this case is the parent, right? The parent's sitting there holding the baby in the mirror going, see, that's you there. And what the baby over time comes to see is that there's certain features about itself that the parent enjoys, that the parent esteems or values over other ones. And so it's not just the literal perceptual image, it's certain features or signifiers, right? Because words point these features out, or the signifiers point them out, that the parent talks about. And so now the ego's development depends on this, essentially this gaze from the other, which is the parent, which the parent embodies the social order. It embodies language. It embodies culture and custom, right? Those of you who know Heidegger, it's the Dothmann aspect to the parent. The parent is, the parent carries this generic aspect of society within them, and it's through this that the child will eventually assimilate into the social order, the big other, Dothmann.
So Dothmann you could roughly say it's the public, it's the average everydayness,
Mm-hmm.
it's so big
Standards,
other.
practices, norms.
Yeah, and I like the example that I think. So I've read a couple of the introductory sort of texts. Mikey, if you're asking how to get into Lacan, Mikey always points you towards secondary texts, and this is the only thinker that he'll do that with. But I will say though that when okay, I would personally just read Michael's blog, The Dangerous Maybe blog. I would read his article on objet petit a. We can turn to that in a second. We'll get into it because obviously that's a very popular concept. A lot of people have a lot of trouble with it, and your blog post on it is one of the most popular things you've done, or if not the.
Yeah, it's the most popular. And I mean, and the reason it's that concept in particular is so important is Lacan himself considered it to be his greatest concept, his greatest contribution to psychoanalysis. He doesn't think you find a correlate to it in Freudian psychoanalysis. So you could say it's his key concept. And so that's why Lacanians put so much emphasis on it.
Okay, well, we can come back to that in a second, but I just want to use Lionel Bailey's example from understanding or reading Lacan. It's actually available on Audible, and I listened to it twice,
Wonderful
and
introduction.
it's a great introduction. Yeah, and I know a few professors who've read it too. But one of the examples that he uses is like when we're talking about the development of an ego, the development of the sense of I-ness, which is kind of like, you've got your primary caregiver, you've got whoever else is in the household, and there's parts of you that they encourage or discourage, and there's like the whole kind of like you're being repressed into this shape, almost like cookie dough being put into a shape, right?
Yeah.
And but a big part of it is that you're able to control certain things. You learn how to control when you shit and piss. You learn how to control, sometimes there's an ability to control crying. Most of the time, obviously, part of being a baby is you have no control over this stuff, and then over time you're basically being forced to learn how to control these things, and it's a traumatic learning experience for everybody involved. Obviously the parents are hating it, the kid is hating it, because when you got a baby screaming at 3 a.m. and nothing you try to satisfy that baby with is seeming to help, it's one of the worst things ever. Well, but one of the examples that he uses of how that subjectivity forming is gaining a sense for the big other, which I'll just do big O for now. We got big other over here, is when they use the example of mama saying, I know I can't though, I have to go to work, right? Through a series of interactions like this, it dawns on the consciousness of this forming subjectivity. There are outside forces that they account to. So first of all, I was reliant on these people, and I thought these people were God and could do everything. And now I discover they actually can't do everything, and they're afraid of other forces in the world that they themselves have to answer to. Mm-hmm. And language and all the etiquette and ethics and stuff that we learn is all kind of like the basically bureaucratic acrobatics for being able to navigate the big other.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I've got it. I want to touch on Lacan's concept of the Oedipus Complex, which is we're already kind of there, right? But we'll come back to it in a minute. But one of the key aspects.
Can I preface it before you do it? Because okay, so we're gonna get into that before we do objet petit a. Look, people who are big nerds for philosophy can just turn their brains off the moment they hear Oedipus Complex, and people who aren't into philosophy at all, who've had like a psychology 101 sort of brush past Freud. Maybe they spent one day on Freud, maybe they only had like 5 minutes with Freud. It sounds cartoonish, and Freud himself has been made a cartoon, right? And so maybe talk about Lacan's resuscitation of that, and then use this as your example. But we better address it.
Yeah, I want to come back to the Oedipus Complex in a minute, because we need to flesh out these orders first to make sense. But I will say this about it right now. So the later Lacan basically drops all talk of the Oedipus complex. But the Lacan of the 1950s, the Lacan who was focused on the symbolic, he rethought the Oedipus complex. And so the way he rethinks it is, look, the mother's not a literal person, right? It's not. It doesn't have to be a biological female, right? The way that, you know, there's a certain gender essentialism that seems at play in how people think about the Oedipus complex. But for Lacan, the mother is the primary caregiver. Well, that could be a guy. It could be two guys. It could be, you know, it could be whoever, right? Those kind of features, you know, don't matter. What the mother is a function. What the father is a function, right? And so it's not one's biological reality that determines whether or not you're the father or the mother in the scenario. One's biological mother could be the father, and one's biological mother could be the father,
Right.
and vice versa. Maybe I got
Yeah, who's the obsessive and who's also the primary caregiver? Like those are two things that would have to link up
right.
to
So if
make
your
it.
dad is your primary caregiver,
Right.
then your dad's your mother, and if your mom is the one who breaks apart this unity between you and your father, then she is the father in this scenario. And so he broadens out in this kind of functional way who the mother is, who the father is, and so on and so forth. And so we'll come back to that, right? Because I want to flesh out these other concepts first, and then we will come back to the Oedipus complex because there's more to say. But
Okay.
I'll just say that what he essentially does is he gets rid of the essentialist, literalist interpretation of the Oedipus complex, and he presents a structuralist concept of it, right? Which, instead of it having to be literal biological types or literal social types, it is a matter of social functions that define the Oedipus complex. And so, okay, we've talked about the imaginary. I'll just close with saying a couple more things. So he ends up coming to make this distinction. You have your ego, which is your basic sense of self, and that ego is actually, the content of it is not some pure element in consciousness, like, you know, some pure Cartesian ego. It's a collection of images, right? And again, those images make up your fundamental sense of identity, and yet you are not those images, right? So there's misrecognition involved. But what Lacan will come to do is make another distinction. So the ego is also built around the ideal ego and the ego ideal. And so these are aspects of the ego that he builds onto the concept of the ego itself. So the ego, the ideal ego, is that idealized image of yourself that you have. We all have some sort of image or images in our head of how we'd like to be, and we aspire to realize those images, right? And so these are the imaginary.
So ego ideal is me. I'm
your
in this.
idealized image of yourself.
Okay, yeah, it's like I teach and I organize and it's like this whole thing that I want to become, that I'm working on becoming.
It's ideal, Dave. It's the self you yourself think about and want to become.
Okay.
And it's imaginary because it's an image. It's a literal product of your imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's in the imaginary register, along with, I mean, of course you have your basic imago, the basic reflection in the mirror that you base your identity off of. But then you have this more private, idealized image of yourself in your imaginary register, your imagination.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the key trick, and this is where Žižek talks about this in Sublime Objective Ideology. What we miss out is that there's a more fundamental aspect to our ideal ego than we realize. We think we just spontaneously want to be this ideal image of ourselves out of, I don't know, just personal preference or a personal choice, right? But what Lacan and Žižek show is that the ideal ego is always based on the ego ideal. And the ego ideal is that gaze, or that gaze with its set of values, for whom we want to be our ideal self. We want to be our ideal self for some other, the desire of the other, or and that other has its own set of values. That's what makes our ideal ego precious to us.
So your ideal ego is the thing you aspire to be. It's the image of yourself but that's like a key to unlock the desire or the affirmation or the recognition of someone else or some abstract other.
Imagine a teenage boy, to take a straightforward example. This kid wants nothing more than to be a superstar athlete. Spends all his time wanting to be the superstar athlete, and he's convinced that, oh, I've just made this choice. This is who I want to be. But growing up, he was constantly bombarded by his father's failed aspirations to become a superstar athlete, and it's the father who structures his ideal ego. The father's valuation, privileging us of being an athlete, is the system of values, the gaze, right? Because we can talk about gaze in a little bit, but it's the father that structures the ideal ego, and it's the father in the symbolic capacity. It's his values, right? It's not images that make up the ego ideal. It's basically a set of values, right? And more importantly, it's a gaze that looks at you from the perspective of these values. So the ideal ego is the image of yourself in your idealized form, and the ego ideal is the gaze or set of values you want to be that idealized self for. And so our fundamental identity is always geared towards the other. When people tell you, oh, I'm just going to be me, I don't care what other people think, it's bullshit. You care about what some other thinks. And that's the fundamental aspect of where you got to go to critique your identity, right? It's not enough to break apart your idealized image of yourself. You have to go to the root core of it, which is those fundamental values, that fundamental valuating gaze for whom you want to be that idealized self. And so
I think Brazilian picked up on my drawing. I'm not sure.
I haven't seen it.
Oh,
okay.
I just gave the dad a giant cock. So.
Oh, I see. Good. You have the Baronian knot there.
It's the phallus. This is the phallus. But it's not the real phallus.
Hey, the phallus is not the literal penis.
It's not the literal. Okay, that's a big part of the salvaging of the Freudian project. Is that for this is not literal shit, right? This is. But okay, so
we'll talk about the phallus in a minute. So
really quick, so what I did was I did a person imagining a trophy. It's them winning that trophy, and then if they won that trophy, they could get the respect of, in this case, it's daddy.
Yeah.
Daddy, it's not dad who's the ego ideal. It's daddy's gaze of respect. You want the affirmation and respect of this person. And the thing is you could also and so a lot of people in their like critiques of this whole kind of thing. I've heard it like out. People just spit it out like mid conversation. So it always comes up is like, there's no like one formative instance like this. And it's like, well, they know that. They're not saying that. Like the mirror stage doesn't happen all at once. It happens over happens over a period of time. And this force out there of affirmation, respect, recognition that you desire, you desire the desire of the other. You desire the affirmation and respect and recognition of the other.
But you also desire what the other desires.
And you desire what the other desires too. Like, yeah. And or because you fucking hate your dad, maybe you desire whatever the opposite of what your dad desired, right?
Exactly.
And so
his desire is causing yours, but you're opposed to it. So it's still ultimately determining yours.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I'm looking at, you've got the Borromean knot for people in the chat. This is one way that Lacan symbolizes his three registers. Dave, the one thing I would say, cross out ego ideal. Ego ideal belongs in the symbolic.
Ego ideal?
Yeah, or you can put it, see in the space where they intersect. Ego ideal would belong in the overlap between imaginary and symbolic. See where you have reality?
Right there. I did it.
Yeah, because it's determining your ego, which is in the imaginary, but it's also a set of values, right, which are rooted in the symbolic. So it would go in that intersection there. And you could also write the big other in the symbolic.
Good. Good to know. Okay, good. Okay, big other, which means I'll go ahead and take it off of right here.
If you want to write something above the bar for ideal ego, just write ego.
But Roska in the live chat had asked, you're gonna love this question because this is about Twin Peaks and it ties into the imaginary, which we're still not off the topic of that, so that's good. And Brazilian, we're gonna get to a bunch of your questions because you've asked lots of really good ones. But where's Roska? Has anyone seen Twin Peaks? Is Bob a viral imago?
Wow, that's a that's a question right there.
I told him you'd like that question.
Oh, I love it. I love a question like that I is immediately great, and yet I have no scripted response to. That's a question that really would make me have to think. No, I think, of course, Bob is represented as this image, right? But ultimately, Bob, the entity, would be in the real, right? What Bob does is shatter our sense of reality. And so just like Freddy Krueger or any of these horror icons, any kind of explosion of some sort of real thing that shatters our sense of reality. Coronavirus has largely been sent by the real. I mean, I don't mean to put it like that, but we didn't see it coming, and yeah, we had some basic ideas. Pandemics happen from time to time, but when it actually hits, it just breaks down the very structure of our reality, and we're all left dealing with this trauma that the real has, it's exploded into our reality, right? So, whether we're talking about what Bob did, especially to Laura Palmer, right? But also to the cops and the other characters in Twin Peaks, but especially to Laura Palmer. Bob is on the side of the real, yet Laura's life prior to Bob is in the imaginary symbolic, right? That's her social reality. But then this thing intrudes upon it that breaks it apart. And this is what real life trauma does as well. But Žižek has talked about this, and other Lacanians talk about it, where horror movies are a great example of this, where whether you're talking about a demon or a ghost or a monster, or something like Freddy Krueger, once this thing erupts into your life, you can't, your whole world is shattered, right? You don't even know how to begin to put your world back together again after this traumatic real has shattered it apart. And so, yeah, I totally understand why we would associate Bob with the imaginary insofar as he is this image, but that's really the only way they had to depict him. More than anything, he's a formless spirit, right? He's a demon, and so yeah, Bob as an entity would be the real. He'd be registered in the real.
One thing I loved here in chat was that Sober Cookie was like, that's the thing that pissed me off the most growing up and having low self-esteem. People telling me not to care what others think. Like, how do you even do that? And I would just add on to the top of that when people say, just be yourself. No fuss, just be yourself. Which is like a total American ego psychology, self-help presupposition in the first place, that you have a self, that you can be. And people who feel like they have this secure, substantive sense of self, that can be a lot of fucking delusion at work. And the more Lacanian approach, or perhaps we might just even say the more French approach. I mean, hell, you could also say this is like a more Buddhist approach, is just to accept that there's not a fucking Heidegger as well. There's no fundamental you. You might be like, look, I'll never fucking eat spinach as long as I live, or whatever. Like, there might be things about you that are particulars that are part of your identity with how you mediate the world, and that's fine. but this idea that you have a substantive ego, that it's a real thing, and that it is the key to unlock all the blessings of capitalism. If you could just find yourself, own yourself, be yourself, then capitalism will work for you.
Act rationally in relation to the market.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than sublime objective ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to sublime objective ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of the University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of the University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money, that's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city near you sometime this year, and I hope that you'll take one of my classes. Thanks.